Stop the treatment. You're making it worse. A 16-year-old black girl in a janitor's uniform burst into the hospital suite, where 14 world-renowned doctors stood frozen in shock. Security immediately moved toward her, but she didn't back down. "I know what's wrong with him," Grace Slessor said, her voice shaking but determined. "And if you don't listen to me right now, that boy is going to die." Dave Stelling, one of America's richest tech billionaires, turned from the window where he'd been watching his 9-year-old son, Frankie, convulse in terror for the 4th time that day. His eyes were hollow from 6 weeks of helpless desperation. "Who are you?" Dave whispered. "I'm nobody," Grace said, pulling a small cloth bag from her pocket. "Just the girl who mops these floors at night. But my grandmother was a healer in Cameroon, and she taught me something these doctors don't know." She held up the bag of dried herbs and roots. "Your son isn't mentally ill, he's being poisoned, and I can prove it." Dr. Helena Marsh, chief of neurology at Boston Memorial Hospital, should have thrown Grace out immediately. A teenage janitor claiming she could cure what the world's best doctors couldn't? It was absurd, dangerous, potentially illegal. But as she watched 9-year-old Frankie Stelling scream about demons crawling on his skin, his small hands clawing at invisible horrors, she realized they were out of options. "Let her try," Dave said, his voice breaking. "God help me, let her try." What happened next would expose a deadly secret hidden in America's wealthiest homes, save dozens of children from misdiagnosis, and prove that sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody expected to listen to. Before we continue, if you hate conspiracy and evil humans, please like, comment, and subscribe. The people who don't are usually siding with evil. But to understand how a teenage girl with no medical degree solved a mystery that stumped 14 specialists, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier. Grace Slessor stood in the cramped bathroom of her family's Roxbury apartment, washing her janitor's uniform in the sink because the laundromat cost money they didn't have. At 16 years old, she worked the night shift at Boston Memorial Hospital, mopping floors and cleaning rooms after her high school classes ended. Her father Samuel worked as a security guard. Her 2 younger brothers, Malcolm, 14, and Joseph, 11, shared a single bedroom. They survived on Samuel's paycheck and Grace's minimum wage, living paycheck to paycheck in a city where rent kept climbing and opportunity kept shrinking. But Grace had something that poverty couldn't take away: knowledge. Her grandmother, Mama Afua, had been a traditional healer in their village in Cameroon before the family immigrated to America. Before she died 2 years ago, she had spent countless hours teaching Grace about medicinal plants, spiritual wellness, and healing practices that stretched back centuries. "Modern doctors are good at some things, child," Mama Afua would say as she crushed herbs in her mortar. "They have machines that can see inside the body, medicines that can kill infections, but they've forgotten something important." "What's that, Grandma?" "That the body is not separate from the spirit, that healing isn't just about removing symptoms, it's about understanding the whole person, their environment, their history, their soul." Grace had watched her grandmother cure people in their community who doctors had given up on, a woman with chronic pain that no medication could touch, healed with specific pressure points and herbal teas, a child with terrible nightmares, cured after Mama Afua identified mold in their apartment that was releasing toxins, an elderly man with tremors, treated with herbs that helped his body eliminate accumulated heavy metals from years of factory work. "You have the gift too," Mama Afua had told Grace on her deathbed. "I can see it in how you watch, how you listen, how you understand. Promise me you'll use it," Grace had promised. but she never imagined that promise would lead her to one of Boston's wealthiest families. Meanwhile, across the city, Dave Stelling stood in his son's bedroom in their $15 million mansion on Beacon Hill, watching Frankie sleep fitfully. At 42 years old, Dave had built Stelling Technologies into an $8 billion empire. He owned properties on 3 continents, employed thousands of people, and had enough money to buy almost anything he wanted. Almost anything except his son's health. 9-year-old Frankie had been a perfectly healthy, brilliant child until 6 weeks ago. He loved chemistry experiments, could solve complex math problems in his head, and dreamed of becoming a scientist. He was gentle, curious, and full of life. Then, seemingly overnight, everything changed. It started on a Tuesday morning. Frankie woke up screaming about spiders crawling on his ceiling. Dave had assumed it was a nightmare, but the screaming didn't stop. Frankie's eyes were wide with terror, his body rigid, pointing at things that weren't there. "Dad, can't you see them? They're everywhere. Make them stop." The family doctor came immediately, then a psychiatrist, then a neurologist. They ran tests, brain scans, blood work, genetic panels. Everything came back normal. But Frankie kept getting worse. He stopped recognizing people. He refused to eat, convinced his food was poisoned. He would have violent episodes where he'd attack anyone who came near him, fighting invisible threats. He spoke in confused, terrified sentences about shadows with teeth and walls that bled. Dave flew in specialists from London, Tokyo, Switzerland, and New York. He spent over $3 million on treatments, experimental therapies, and cutting-edge medical technology. They tried antipsychotics, sedatives, experimental drugs from clinical trials in Europe. Nothing worked. The diagnosis was always the same: persistent delirium with psychotic features of unknown origin, which was a fancy way of saying, "We have no idea what's wrong with your son." Dave watched helplessly as his vibrant, joyful boy disappeared into a nightmare. Frankie had been admitted to Boston Memorial 2 weeks ago when he stopped sleeping entirely, his screams echoing through their mansion at all hours. "Mr. Stelling," Dr. Helena Marsh had told him yesterday, her voice heavy with defeat. "We've exhausted every treatment protocol. If we can't stabilize Frankie within 48 hours, we may need to consider permanent psychiatric institutionalization." Dave had broken down crying in the hospital hallway. For a man who had built his fortune on solving impossible problems, this felt like the ultimate failure. He didn't know that the answer to his son's illness was about to walk through his door in the most unexpected way. Grace was mopping the hallway on the 7th floor, the private suites where Boston's wealthiest patients stayed, when she heard screaming coming from room 742. She'd been cleaning this hallway for 2 weeks now, and she'd noticed the boy in that room, Frankie Stelling. The doctors talked about him in hushed, frustrated tones. The nurses looked exhausted and sad. Security had been posted outside his door after he'd tried to jump out a window, screaming about demons chasing him. Tonight, the screaming was worse than usual. Grace paused outside the room, peering through the small window. Inside, she could see a small boy thrashing in his bed, surrounded by people in white coats. Machines beeped urgently. A tall man, the boy's father, Grace assumed, stood by the window with his head in his hands. And suddenly, Grace's heart stopped. She recognized those symptoms: the rigid body movements, the unseeing eyes that tracked things that weren't there, the desperate, terrified screaming, the way the boy clawed at his own skin as if trying to remove something invisible. Grace had seen this exact thing before. She was 12 years old, back in Cameroon visiting relatives. A neighbor's son, a boy named Kwame, had started acting exactly like this, seeing things, screaming about monsters, attacking people. The doctors in the city had diagnosed him with early-onset schizophrenia and wanted to institutionalize him permanently. But Mama Afua had known better. "This child is not mentally ill," her grandmother had said firmly. "His spirit is being poisoned. Something in his environment is hurting his brain." Mama Afua had questioned the family carefully, examined Kwame's room, and discovered old colonial-era military medals the boy had found buried in the dirt near their house. The medals were corroded and covered in toxic residue, mercury, lead, arsenic released from the deteriorating metal. Once the medals were removed and Kwame was given specific herbs to help his body eliminate the toxins, he had recovered completely. Within 2 weeks, Grace stood frozen in the hospital hallway, watching Frankie Stelling scream, and she knew what was wrong with him. But who would listen to her? She was 16 years old. She was a janitor. She had no medical degree, no credentials, no authority. She was just the black girl who mopped floors. But as Grace watched the doctors fail again, as she saw the father's desperation, as she heard Dr. Marsh say the words permanent institutionalization, she remembered Mama Afua's final words. "Knowledge that isn't shared is knowledge wasted, child. If you can help someone and you choose not to, you become part of their suffering." Grace Slessor put down her mop, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change her life forever. She opened the door to room 742. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the shocked silence. "I think I know what's wrong with him. What happens next will prove that sometimes the greatest medical breakthroughs don't come from laboratories or prestigious universities. Sometimes they come from grandmothers teaching their grandchildren, from communities passing down wisdom through generations, and from teenagers brave enough to speak up even when the entire world expects them to stay silent." This is the story of how Grace Slessor saved Frankie Stelling's life, exposed a deadly conspiracy targeting America's wealthiest families, and changed modern medicine forever. And it all started with a teenage janitor, a bag of herbs, and the courage to say, "I can help him." The hospital room fell into shocked silence. 14 doctors turned to stare at Grace Slessor, standing in the doorway, still holding her mop bucket. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. Dr. Bernard Winters, a visiting specialist from Johns Hopkins, looked openly contemptuous. "Security," he barked. "Remove this girl immediately. This is a medical emergency, not a—" "Wait!" Dave Stelling's voice cut through the room like a knife. He stepped away from the window, his eyes locked on Grace. "You said you know what's wrong with my son?" Grace's hands were trembling, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "Yes, sir, I believe I do." "This is absurd," Dr. Winters sputtered. "We don't have time for—" "I said wait!" Dave's voice rose with desperate authority. He moved toward Grace, his face haggard with exhaustion and hope. "What's your name?" "Grace Slessor, sir. I work here. Night shift janitorial staff." A murmur rippled through the medical team. Dr. Helena Marsh stepped forward, her expression caught between skepticism and curiosity. "Grace, I appreciate that you want to help, but this is a complex medical case. We have specialists from—" "I know who you have," Grace interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I've been cleaning this hallway for 2 weeks. I've listened to every consultation, every diagnosis, every failed treatment." She took a breath and looked directly at Dr. Marsh. "And I've watched you all look in the wrong place." "The wrong place?" Dr. Marsh's eyebrows rose. Grace set down her mop bucket and approached Frankie's bed carefully. The boy had stopped convulsing temporarily, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes rolled back showing only whites. "You've been treating this as a psychiatric condition," Grace said. testing for epilepsy, genetic disorders, brain abnormalities, but his symptoms, they remind me of something else, something my grandmother treated back in Cameroon. Your grandmother? Dr. Winters scoffed. And what exactly are her credentials? Grace met his gaze steadily. She saved lives for 40 years when doctors like you said there was no hope. The room erupted in arguments. Several doctors demanded Grace be removed. Others defended her right to speak, but Dave Stelling held up his hand, and the room fell silent again. My son is dying, Dave said, his voice breaking, and every expert in this room has told me they don't know why, so I'm going to do something I've never done in my life. He looked at Grace. I'm going to trust someone with absolutely nothing to lose and everything to prove. He gestured toward Frankie. Talk. Tell me what you see that they don't. Grace took a deep breath, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would either save Frankie Stelling's life or destroy any chance she had of ever being taken seriously again. Mr. Stelling, she said quietly, when did your son's symptoms start? The exact day, if you can remember. And with that question, everything began to unravel. For a moment, Grace Slessor couldn't breathe. 14 doctors stared at her like she had walked into a courtroom and confessed to a crime. Security stepped forward, ready to drag her out, but she held her ground, fingers tight around the handle of her mop bucket. She had known this would happen. She looked too young, too poor, too out of place to be taken seriously in a room like this. But the sound of Frankie's terrified breathing pushed her forward. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. I recognize what's happening to him. Dr. Winters let out a harsh laugh. From what? A YouTube video? Grace didn't flinch. She was used to that tone, the one that reminded her she had started earning money at 13, cleaning office bathrooms after school because her father couldn't cover rent alone. She had lived through worse things than a doctor's condescension. Her eyes drifted briefly to Frankie's pale, shaking body. For a flicker of a moment she saw another boy, 12-year-old Kwame in Cameroon, thrashing on a dusty floor, screaming at monsters no one else could see. Back then, Grace had stood beside Mama Afua, her grandmother, watching her move with calm confidence. People in the village whispered that Mama Afua had healing in her blood. But Grace knew better. Her grandmother simply understood what others overlooked. She remembered the day Kwame's parents begged the local doctor to help their son. The doctor had thrown up his hands and declared madness. But Mama Afua had asked questions no one else thought to ask. Where did Kwame play? What did he touch? What had changed in his home? Grace had followed her into the boy's room, watched her pick up the old corroded military medals he'd found near the river, watched her face tighten. Within hours, she had identified the medals as the silent killers. Within weeks, the boy was himself again. Grace had never forgotten the look of gratitude on Kwame's face, or her grandmother's words later that night. Real healing begins with paying attention. Even children can see what grown men refuse to. And now, years later, here she was in Boston Memorial Hospital, holding nothing but a cloth pouch of herbs and the last of her grandmother's teachings. She had tried to stay silent. For nearly 3 months, she had quietly mopped floors, listening to doctors debate, while Frankie's condition deteriorated. She cleaned their offices, emptied their trash, overheard their frustrations. But it wasn't until today, when Grace heard the words permanent institutionalization, that her legs carried her, almost against her will, through the door. Dave Stelling looked at her with hollow eyes, as if he were clinging to the last thread of hope in the room. Let her speak, he said softly. Security hesitated. The doctors exchanged looks. Grace felt her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. This was her moment. the moment Mama Efua had prepared her for without ever knowing it. Grace stepped forward. "I think your son is being poisoned," she said quietly, "and I can explain how." The room fell silent again, but this time, nobody moved. Grace stepped closer to Frankie's bed, aware of every breath in the room. 14 specialists, 2 security guards, a billionaire father, and a dying child were all waiting for her next words. She kept her voice steady. "I need to know the exact day his symptoms started." Dave blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. His mind searched through the panic of the past weeks. "It was a Tuesday, 6 weeks ago, early morning. He woke up screaming." Grace nodded slowly. "Did anything change in the house the day before? Anything new added to his room?" Dr. Winters scoffed again, but Dr. Helena Marsh held up a hand, signaling him to be quiet. Dave frowned as he tried to remember, then his eyes widened. "The sculptures. I had 3 antique bronze pieces installed in his bedroom. They were part of a larger collection. He loved them." Grace felt a chill. "Were they old? From the 19th century?" "Yes, French and English, bought at a private auction." Grace took a breath. This was it. "Sir, very old bronze sculptures often contain mercury, lead, or arsenic. Over time, especially in a warm room, they release invisible vapors. You breathe them in while you sleep. Children absorb them faster than adults." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Dr. Marsh stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "Mercury vapor presents almost exactly like psychiatric illness, hallucinations, tremors, paranoia, cognitive decline." One of the toxicologists whispered, "Blood tests would miss it. Most vapor-based metals bind to neurological tissue quickly." Grace nodded. "The only reliable test is hair or nails, not blood." Dr. Winters shook his head angrily. "This is nonsense. This girl is untrained. You cannot take medical advice from someone who cleans floors." Dave rounded on, him voice rising with months of frustration. "And yet 14 trained specialists failed. My son is getting worse every day. So unless you can offer an explanation better than hers, stay quiet." The room froze. Dr. Marsh exhaled slowly. "She is not wrong about the metals. It is rare but possible. If those sculptures contain contaminants, the vapor could easily cause this." Dave turned to the nearest nurse. "Call my house manager. Remove every piece of metal art from the property. Immediately." Grace pulled a small cloth from her pocket. Inside were a few strands of her own hair, kept from a lesson long ago. "If you test his hair, you'll know. The same metals that poisoned the boy in Cameroon could poison Frankie." Dr. Marsh took the cloth bag gently, her eyes softening with respect. "We will run the test." Hours passed in tense silence. Grace waited outside, knees shaking. She knew what the results would show, but doubt clawed at her anyway. Then Dr. Marsh returned. She held a printed lab sheet and looked directly at Grace. "The sculptures are releasing mercury at more than 400 times the allowed limit." Dave sagged against the wall, tears streaming down his face. Dr. Marsh spoke again, voice trembling. "You were right about everything." The hospital room felt different the next morning. The chaos of machines and shouting doctors had quieted. Frankie lay still, breathing in slow, shallow waves, his face pale but no longer contorted with terror. Grace sat beside him, her hands resting calmly on her knees. She watched his eyelids twitch and felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. The poison was no longer entering his body. Now came the hard part. Undoing 6 weeks of fear. Dave entered quietly, carrying a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. He studied Grace as if she were the only solid thing left in his collapsing world. "Dr. Marsh started the treatment you recommended," he said. "They call it chelation. They said it will pull the metal out of his body. But you said that is not enough. Grace nodded. His body was poisoned, but so was his mind. He has been trapped inside his own fear for weeks. Even when the metals leave his blood, the memories stay. He needs help finding his way back. Dave swallowed hard. Tell me what you need. Grace hesitated. She knew how this would sound in a room built on science and clean lines and perfect logic. My grandmother taught me ways to calm the spirit, she said carefully. Songs that slow the mind, herbs that help the heart rest, words that remind the body it is safe again. I want to use them with your permission, not instead of the doctor's, alongside them. Before Dave could answer, the door opened and Dr. Winters stormed in. Absolutely not. This is reckless. This girl has no credentials. This is not a village ritual. This is a major hospital. Dr. Marsh stepped in after him. She studied Grace for a long moment before speaking. Winters, you have failed this boy for 6 weeks. The rest of us have failed too. But she has been right about everything so far. I will not block her as long as she does nothing harmful. Winters sputtered in outrage. You cannot be serious, Dave cut in. I am. She saved my son's life before any of you even knew what was killing him. If she says this will help, then I want her to try. Grace released a breath she had been holding. She reached into the small cloth bag at her side and pulled out a few dried leaves that smelled faintly of mint and warm earth. She crushed them gently between her fingers and held her hands near Frankie's face so he could breathe the scent. She began to hum, a low, steady rhythm, the same song her grandmother used when calming frightened children back home. The sound filled the room like warm sunlight. Frankie's eyelids fluttered. His breathing eased. For the first time since his collapse, his shoulders relaxed against the pillow. Day by day, his progress grew. The second day, he whispered a single word. The third, he reached for water. The fourth, he asked for his father. By the 7th day, Frankie opened his eyes fully and looked around the room with recognition. Grace knew then that he was coming back to himself, and the world around him was about to change forever. Frankie's recovery spread through the hospital like a quiet miracle. Nurses who had tiptoed around his room now stopped by just to smile at him. Doctors who once dismissed Grace now watched her with careful interest. Dave refused to leave his son's side and thanked Grace so often she began to blush each time. On the morning of the 9th day, Frankie was sitting up in bed, eating oatmeal and laughing softly at a cartoon on the tablet in front of him. Dave looked 10 years younger. Dr. Marsh reviewed his latest results and turned to Grace with open admiration. He is stable. His levels are dropping exactly as predicted. We expect a full recovery. Grace felt pride swell in her chest, but something else tugged at her mind, a question she had not dared ask. Dr. Marsh, she said, were there any other children with symptoms like his? Hallucinations, panic, sudden changes in behavior? Dr. Marsh paused, surprised. There are always psychiatric cases, but none as severe. Grace hesitated. Could I see the list of children admitted in the last month? Just the ones on this floor. Dave watched her closely. You think it might not be only him. I think whatever poisoned Frankie could have hurt others, not just in this hospital, in homes like yours. The room fell silent. Dr. Marsh left to retrieve the files, and when she returned, Grace scanned them quickly. Her heart sank. 2 other children from wealthy neighborhoods had been admitted with unexplained neurological symptoms. One had been labeled early-onset psychosis. The other had been sedated for days. Grace looked up at Dave. I need to visit your house. Dave did not hesitate. I will take you today. The Stelling mansion was enormous, filled with glass and rare art. Yet Grace felt a chill as soon as she entered. Certain rooms carried a faint metallic taste in the air. Frankie's bedroom most of all. Within minutes, she identified 2 more sculptures and a set of heavy antique bookends, leaching the same toxic residue. Dave stared in disbelief as technicians removed them in sealed cases. That evening, Dr. Marsh called with news. The other 2 children showed the same metal traces in their hair. Both began treatment immediately. Within a week, parents from across Boston came seeking guidance. Reporters asked questions the hospital could not yet answer. Dave arranged for Grace to move into the mansion temporarily, both for safety and to assist with ongoing cases. One evening, he sat her down at the long dining table, his expression serious. "Grace, what you discovered here goes far beyond my family. This city needs someone who understands both the science and the tradition behind what saved my son. I want to fund a center, a place where you can teach, research, and heal. A place in your name." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. She had walked into his life as a janitor. Now she was being asked to help reshape medicine itself.